So one of the questions that comes up a lot, and sometimes not even as a question, is, can't the Fed or a central bank just print money? And the answer to that question really is no, not really, probably shouldn't, no, and yes. So let's unpack that a little bit. The first answer is no, because many central banks around the world don't control the means of production of the physical notes. Some of them have their own print production facilities, but many, like the United States, have those notes printed by another agency, or they're printed, as in Canada, by a government chartered company, or some countries around the world use private companies to print those notes. So because they don't control the means of production, they can't just snap their fingers and say, oh, I need $1 billion next week. The second reason is, for most central banks around the world, there are a lot of controls and oversight that prevent that type of thing. The central bank may be independent from the executive branch, but they're not independent of the law of the country or of the legislature, and so they have to abide by those regulations and that oversight to make sure they don't just manufacture money out of thin air. And that's been a source of some frustration, because sometimes actually administrations have wanted central banks to suddenly change monetary policy or even suddenly print a lot of notes, that would have been beneficial, they think, for one reason or another. According to Sarah Binder, professor at George Washington University, President Johnson famously said of then Fed Chair Martin, quote, "You won't print the money I need." Also, most central banks around the world are committed to having responsible balance sheets, and greatly inflating the number of notes you have relative to the assets you have on your balance sheet is not a responsible thing to do, and so most central banks don't do that kind of thing. That said, there have been times in history where a central bank around the world has just quote-unquote printed money, and often to the peril of the country, and that's why these experiences are so memorable to people. In the case of Zimbabwe between 2007 and 2008, the Zimbabwe government went from printing $10 notes to $10,000 notes to $10 million notes to notes that had a face value of $100 billion. The last reason is sort of a yes and a no. Many central banks around the world are independent of their executive branches of government, not independent of government and of oversight, but independent of the executive branch. So they still answer to the legislature, they still answer to the law of the land, but they don't have to answer to the shorter term objectives of the current administration. It is still true that central banks around the world and the United States Central Bank do have a certain amount of autonomy within the structure of government oversight and within the structure of the law of the land to adjust their balance sheet, increasing assets or decreasing assets, increasing and decreasing certain line items on that balance sheet, including their currency outstanding. And so they do have the autonomy to increase the money supply or reduce it. That said, I think for the reasons that I've described here, you can see why it's not as simple as, quote unquote, just print the money. And if you're interested in this topic, let me know, because there's some great reading opportunities in the class bibliography. So we'll talk more about this in class and look forward to talking to you. Thanks.